I didn't disappear in a dramatic way. No arguments. No slammed doors. No final phone calls. I just stopped showing up. That's the part people never understand. They imagine that leaving a life requires courage, rage, or some grand reason. But for me, it happened quietly. Almost politely. Like stepping out of a room while everyone else is still talking, hoping no one notices the empty chair. The truth is, my life didn't collapse in a single moment. It eroded. Slowly. Patiently. Day by day. Until one morning I woke up and realized I had been living on autopilot for so long that I no longer recognized the person breathing next to me in the mirror. I didn't hate my life. That's what makes this harder to explain. I wasn't abused. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't starving or hunted by debt or addiction. I had a job that paid the bills. A home that stayed warm in winter. People who knew my name. And yet, every night, I went to bed feeling like I had failed something important, even though I couldn't say exactly what. It started with the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The silence that fills a room even when someone else is talking. The silence that follows you into conversations, into laughter, into routine greetings. I would sit across from people I loved and feel like I was watching myself from very far away, as if I had already left but forgotten to take my body with me. At first, I blamed exhaustion. Then stress. Then age. That's what adults do. We explain away the unbearable with words that sound responsible. But deep down, I knew. I had become a version of myself that existed only to maintain things. Maintain relationships. Maintain appearances. Maintain stability. I was a caretaker of a life that no longer felt like mine. Every decision I made was safe. Logical. Predictable. And every one of those decisions took me further away from the person I once believed I would become. I used to imagine my future vividly. I remember lying awake at night in my 20s, my mind burning with possibilities. Different cities. Different paths, different versions of me. I thought life would narrow those options naturally, but I didn't expect it to suffocate them completely. Somewhere along the way, I stopped choosing and started complying. I complied with expectations. With routines. With the unspoken agreement that once you reach a certain point, you stop asking dangerous questions. Questions like, is this really it? Questions like, if I keep going like this, will I recognize myself in 10 years? Those questions became louder at night. During the day, I functioned well. I smiled at the right moments. I answered emails. I made plans. I showed up. People trusted me because I was reliable. Consistent. Calm. They didn't see that inside, I was shrinking. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes from being needed but not known. From being appreciated for your role, not your soul. And I played my role perfectly. Too perfectly. The first time the thought of leaving crossed my mind, it terrified me. I dismissed it immediately. I told myself it was irresponsible, selfish, childish. Only broken people run away, I thought. Only people who can't handle life do that. I didn't realize then that staying can be just as destructive as leaving. Weeks passed. Then months. The thought returned, quieter but more persistent. Not as an impulse, but as a whisper. A suggestion. A possibility. What if I didn't fix anything? What if I didn't try harder? What if I just stopped? That idea scared me more than any crisis ever had. Because once you imagine leaving, you start noticing how invisible you already are. I noticed how rarely anyone asked how I was doing and waited for the real answer. I noticed how easily days passed without anyone needing anything truly personal from me. I noticed how irreplaceable my presence felt. And the most painful realization of all, if I disappeared tomorrow, people would be shocked but their lives would continue almost unchanged. That wasn't their fault. It was mine. I had trained everyone to see me as stable, not deep. Present, not essential. I had made myself small to be easy to live with. The night I decided to leave, nothing dramatic happened. I washed the dishes. I folded clothes. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. And then I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness. Not excitement. Just relief. Like loosening a tight knot you didn't realize was strangling you. I didn't pack much. A small bag. Documents. Some clothes. Nothing sentimental. I left photographs behind. Gifts. Traces of the life I was stepping away from. It wasn't because they meant nothing. It was because they meant too much. I wrote no letter. I told no one. Not because I didn't care but because I knew if I explained myself, I might be convinced to stay. And staying would have killed me slowly. When I closed the door behind me, I expected panic. Guilt. Regret. Instead, I felt hollow. As if I had finally matched the emptiness I'd been carrying inside for years. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew where I could no longer remain. And that was the moment I truly disappeared, not from their lives, but from the version of myself that had been surviving instead of living. The first weeks after I left felt unreal, like living inside someone else's dream. I moved through cities without attachment, slept in places that didn't know my name, woke up without obligations pressing on my chest. There was no schedule to betray, no expectations waiting for me at the end of the day. For the first time in years, my time belonged to no one but me. And yet, freedom didn't feel the way I thought it would. It wasn't light. It wasn't joyful. It was quiet. Uncomfortably quiet. When you strip your life down to the essentials, you learn something brutal very quickly: distraction is not the same as meaning. Without routines to hide behind, without people mirroring your identity back to you, you are left alone with the one thing you've been avoiding: yourself. At night, the silence became louder than it had ever been before. There were moments when I would sit on the edge of a rented bed, staring at unfamiliar walls, suddenly overwhelmed by a strange grief. Not for the people I left behind, at least not at first, but for the version of me that had believed leaving would fix everything. I thought escape would bring clarity. Instead, it brought confrontation. Without anyone to perform for, my thoughts became darker. Sharper. More honest. I started noticing how often my mind drifted back to old memories, not the good ones, but the moments where I had chosen safety over truth, comfort over desire, approval over authenticity. I realized I hadn't just abandoned my life. I had abandoned myself long before that. Leaving didn't make me brave. It simply removed the noise that had been drowning out my regret. There were days I barely spoke. Sometimes an entire day would pass without my voice leaving my mouth. I would catch my reflection in shop windows and feel disconnected from it, like I was watching a stranger wear my face. I expected guilt to arrive immediately, but it came in waves. Subtle at first. Then suffocating. I would imagine the confusion I had caused. The questions with no answers. The silence I left behind. I told myself they would move on quickly, and that thought hurt more than I expected. Because part of me wanted to be missed. Not dramatically. Not desperately. Just, noticed. I wondered if anyone searched for me in quiet moments. If anyone felt the absence where my presence used to be. Or if my disappearance blended seamlessly into the background of their lives, like furniture quietly removed from a room. Some nights, I almost went back. Not because I wanted that life again, but because loneliness has a way of rewriting your memory. It paints the past with softer edges, dulls the pain, magnifies the comfort. It whispers that maybe it wasn't so bad. That maybe you were just ungrateful. But then I would remember the suffocation. The constant sense of betraying myself one small decision at a time. Staying would have meant continuing a slow erasure. And yet, leaving carried its own cost. I learned that running away doesn't erase responsibility, it simply transforms it. Instead of answering to others, I had to answer to myself. And I wasn't prepared for how harsh that judge could be. I began questioning my motives. Was I courageous, or cowardly? Was this a second chance, or a delayed collapse? Had I chosen life, or simply avoided death by routine? There were moments of peace, yes. Small ones. Walking through unfamiliar streets with no history attached to them. Sitting alone in cafes where no one expected anything from me. Waking up without dread. But peace without connection feels incomplete. Hollow. I started to understand something unsettling. Meaning doesn't come from freedom alone. It comes from responsibility freely chosen. From commitment that aligns with who you truly are, not who you pretend to be. I had escaped responsibility, but I hadn't yet chosen anything in its place. That realization scared me. Because if I didn't build something new, something honest, then my disappearance meant nothing. It would just be absence, not transformation. I couldn't return. But I also couldn't keep drifting. The hardest part wasn't missing people. It was missing the possibility of being known, truly known, and realizing I had never allowed that to happen. One evening, sitting alone as the city lights flickered on, I understood something I had avoided for years. My greatest regret wasn't the life I left behind. It was the life I never had the courage to live while I was still there. Leaving didn't absolve me of that truth. It exposed it. And for the first time, I had to decide whether I would continue running or finally face myself without excuses. The turning point didn't arrive as a revelation. There was no moment of clarity, no sudden decision that felt heroic or final. What came instead was exhaustion, the deep, bone-level exhaustion that follows prolonged honesty. I was tired of questioning myself in circles. Tired of romanticizing my escape. Tired of pretending that disappearance alone meant rebirth. One morning, I realized something simple and devastating. I hadn't started a new life. I had only paused the old one. I was alive, yes, but not rooted. Existing in a suspended state between who I had been and who I was afraid to become. Freedom without direction slowly turns into another form of prison, and I could feel its walls closing in. That's when I stopped running. Not geographically, I stayed where I was. But internally, I stopped escaping my own responsibility. I began asking myself harder questions, the kind you can't outrun by changing cities. Questions about who I was when no one was watching. About what I actually wanted, not what sounded noble or safe. About whether I was willing to accept the consequences of becoming someone new, even if that someone failed. I understood then that leaving my old life wasn't the second chance. Taking ownership of my choices was. I didn't reach out to anyone from my past. Not yet. That wasn't courage, it was avoidance dressed up as respect. I needed to know who I was before asking to be seen again. So I built something small. Not a grand reinvention. Not a dramatic transformation. Just structure. I gave myself responsibilities that mattered. Commitments I chose freely. Work that felt aligned, even if imperfect. I allowed myself to be a beginner again, awkward, uncertain, unremarkable. And slowly, something shifted. The silence inside me changed texture. It stopped being accusatory. It became reflective. I could sit alone without feeling like I was disappearing. I could look at my reflection without flinching. I didn't become happier overnight. That's a lie people like to tell. What I became was honest. Honest about my limits. Honest about my regrets. Honest about the fact that some bridges, once burned, leave scars even if you never cross them again. I stopped pretending that leaving had made me innocent. It didn't. People were hurt. Confused. Left without answers. That truth will always belong to me. Growth doesn't erase consequences, it teaches you to carry them without collapsing. There are nights when guilt still visits. Quietly. Respectfully. It sits beside me instead of choking me now. A reminder, not a punishment. And sometimes, I imagine the life I left behind. Not with longing but with clarity. I see how I could have stayed and survived. How I could have grown old in safety. How I might have convinced myself that numbness was normal. But I also see the cost. I would have lost myself entirely. Slowly. Politely. Without protest. Leaving didn't make me a hero. Staying would have made me disappear completely. Now, I live differently. Not louder. Not bigger. Just truer. I let people know me even when it's uncomfortable. I make choices that risk disappointment. I accept uncertainty instead of stability that suffocates. I no longer confuse peace with absence of conflict. And most importantly, I no longer wait for permission to exist as myself. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this: you don't ruin your life by leaving. You ruin it by staying somewhere your soul has already abandoned. I don't know if I'll ever be forgiven. I don't know if reconciliation will come. I don't even know if the path I chose is the right one. But I know this. For the first time, the life I'm living belongs to me. Fully. Painfully. Honestly. And that even with all its scars is something I can finally stand behind without shame. I didn't disappear to escape life. I disappeared so I could stop disappearing inside it.